This is a Chronicle podcast.
This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. These men are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and tragedies of the war wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made. By those who could pay and those who could no longer meet. The price of empire.
Hi, my name's Dan Jobson. I'm a director and filmmaker, and I'm sitting here with Michael Cove to record the first episode of Chronicle's History Making podcast, a podcast that takes us behind the scenes of how history documentaries are made. We're here today to talk about the landmark documentary, The Price of Empire, which was written, narrated, and created by Michael. The intent here is to talk with Michael about where the show came from, why he created it, and of course, the history that he discovered. So to start, Michael, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? How did you become a writer, and especially a documentary writer?
Oh, gosh. Okay, how did I become a writer? Look, a very, very long time ago, this is when I was a schoolboy. And I say schoolboy, not when I was a student or anything exalted like that. I was a schoolboy and I wanted to work in movies or television. So when I finished school, I went to film school. This is in London. And when I finished film school, I joined the BBC as a trainee assistant film editor. But involvement in the industry made me realise, rightly or wrongly, that I would be awful if I tried to do anything in that direction. And so I, by default, became, as they say, a writer. Most of my career, this is a word should be in italics. How do you speak in italics? I don't know. But most of my career as a freelance writer, I was making a living writing for television, for long-form drama, for one-off plays, telemovies, and writing radio drama, which sadly no longer exists in Australia. The world of fiction, the world of drama, is easier because you just make the stuff up. The main problem with factual programming is you can't just make it up. But it still has, from the writer's point of view, the requirement to engage and maintain the interest of the audience, and that's basic storytelling craft. It's just that the challenge is you can't make up stuff to suddenly make a peripheral character an interesting. You can't,
You can't decide someone from history
no,
turned out that...
I can't give Field Marshal Montgomery some intriguing backstory just so that you become interested in what he does when he takes command of the 8th Army. You can't.
Does sound like an interesting film, I'm not going to lie.
Well, yeah, and some supposedly historical films play fast and loose, and maybe in the world of feature films, if you think of recent films like Finest Hour and Dunkirk, people who are well informed about the history find plenty to wince about.
That's right.
In the poetic license, but I think it's permissible when it's a feature film and it's actors and everybody knows that. But a documentary, a factual program, I don't think you can hide behind those conventions. But I think from the writing point of view, for me, that's not an insignificant challenge, but it's the only real challenge.
So when it came to The Price of Empire, how did it actually come about? How did you find the concept for the show? And if you can tell me a little bit broadly about what attracted you to the actual story.
So the impetus for the production was, we've got access to this extraordinary archive. We've got access now to a technology which will enable us to upscale this to HD. And so much of that original is on 35mm film.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah, I'm just to jump ahead of the story a little bit, but I was a bit, I can't say I wasn't cynical, but I wasn't persuaded that seeing this footage in HD was going to be significantly different.
It wasn't going to be the
I
hook.
was wrong. I
Right.
can actually say, in all honesty, that watching the materials in HD when it came back from being processed that way was revelatory.
Wow.
You actually saw things in the frame that you hadn't seen before.
It was just a
It
grainy...
was that different.
Right.
Yeah. So the technical side of it, I think, was completely validated by the result. This was completely virgin territory. We had never made anything like it before.
It sounds quite overwhelming, to be honest, to be given that task.
Yeah. So there was no one to whom I could turn and say, "What do you reckon?" It was just, okay, what seems to be the best way to set forth on this journey? And it just occurred to me, without even thinking about it, and it was probably because we hadn't done anything like it before. So instead of reaching for the usual suspects, so to speak, I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if I could interview people who were participant in the drama? So I went and conducted interviews in Japan, in India, in Russia, in France,
Wow.
in the UK, and in the USA.
Before we actually get into discussing the first episode, just one more overall question. In terms of, say, from the Great War and the Second World War, you're originally from London. What impact did the war have on yourself and your family?
My father... my maternal grandfather, who I love dearly, was... not just a veteran of the First World War. I come from a working class background, and he was Irish, Patrick Collins. He served in India, in the days of the Raj, and then he was taken back to the UK when the war came, served on the Western Front, and he was wounded twice. And so I have the clearest memory of him and of the stories that he shared with me. So that's the First World War. The Second World War, of course, ended not that long before I was born, and my parents were keenly involved. My mother was an air raid warden in London during the Blitz.
Wow.
With lots of stories of that. And my father was in the army, and that was a very shadowy experience.
Okay.
That I was able to disentangle over the years, particularly the years since his death, really.
Yeah.
But I think now, unquestionably, we would say that my father suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. The best of my understanding is that he was in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Mm-hmm. He was attached to, in Dieppe, was almost exclusively Canadian, and he was attached to a Canadian group. He was older than they were. He was, because he volunteered for reasons which I'll come to. They didn't come back, and he did.
Wow.
And he was demobbed. I've got his pay book. Soon after, for no longer meeting Army medical standards. That's what it says to that effect. So there's that part. But the other thing about the Second War, of course, that very much affected my childhood is that although theirs was a mixed marriage, I was brought up as a Jew.
Okay.
And so there was an awareness in the family of what had happened to the relatives that didn't get out. So my paternal grandparents and a lot of relatives associated with them got out of what was then Tsarist Russia in 1905. And the members of the two extended families, my grandfather and grandmother, that didn't get out, perished. And there's some evidence of that. So yeah, it was a very real thing in terms of
that. It's very visceral. You actually, I think there's a line in the first episode of The Price of Empire that's actually just going through the statistics of the cost of lives of the war. And you make really poignantly the point that 14 million people were murdered.
Yeah.
And that's it's just astounding to me that we can even be in the world that we face today, that you can still even see that we're facing these atrocities.
And we're also facing no shortage of people who are happy to deny that ever happened, and launch all sorts of absurd conspiracy theories to explain why the story is out there and why the story is told. So I find all of that a bit sort of unsettling, really, particularly when you're talking about history.
Absolutely. Well, that's probably a good point to jump into, talking about episode 1, The Gathering Storm. This first episode deals with the period between World War I and the build-up to the beginning of World War II. How did you find creating the stories that needed to be told visually, where there might not be as many visuals as the war went on and as movie cameras were capturing more? Were there any moments you find in that period of history that are somewhat underappreciated because they're harder to tell visually?
I think the first thing you try and do is to tell the story, and the problems that you set for yourself and for other people, of course, the editors and the designers and so forth, are there to be solved as best you can. And it sometimes means that they're going to come along and say, look, what am I meant to do here? And the answer is, well, you meant to pass me the red pen and I'll just cross it out. We can't illustrate it. But we're talking, after all, about from late 19th and through the 20th century. So there's this very rich photographic resource.
Absolutely.
The moving image resource doesn't really kick in until the early to mid-20s.
Yeah.
So that's a bit more problematic.
Now, you've mentioned to me before in your writing process that nailing the first line of a show is your most important step. How did the writing process begin?
So, my idiosyncratic method, which probably will appall everybody, is that there's a 13-part series. I never sat down and mapped out 13 episodes. So when I started writing, I had no idea where 13 episodes were going to end.
Okay.
And the first thing to say about the first episode is that it was always likely, though in fact it never happened, that the first episode would be either gutted or completely cancelled.
Okay.
Because it sets up the story. If people say, oh, history of the Second World War, that would be interesting, and they turn it on, that story starts at the end of the first episode. But it seemed to me, from my point of view, as someone who was launching into writing this thing, that I had to start with that. If only for my own sake. I had to start with that so
context.
that I understood the context and I understood how it came about. If you look at the whole series, as a consequence, there is one aspect of episode 1 which is asymptomatic, and that is that I interviewed 50 people. None of them talk about 1919 to 1939. Effectively.
Right. Yep.
So the talking head component is minimal. But, as you say, for me, I mean, there's the period of chewing the carpet and thinking, oh no, this is the one where they find out what an imposter I am and how I've been getting away with a con job all these years because I just don't know what to do here. I have no idea what'll I do. And there is sometimes, if you're lucky, a light bulb moment where you think, I know, it starts with. And in the case of Price of Empire, literally. And so it starts with, on the 22nd day of the 20th century, there was a death in the family. That's the death of Queen Victoria. And I wrote that and kept going, basically.
That was the floodgate.
It was. And it does more than give you a point of departure. It gives you a tone.
How important do you find nailing that tone? Do you think of the tone in your head at the same time you come up with that first line, or do you discover the particular tone of a story as you go?
Well, I am a very strong believer in the importance of not just tone, but a consistent tone and an identifiable tone. And the reason is that I believe writing a narration, it doesn't matter what the program is. Don't bother me with all of this, it's factual and it's historical and it's documentary. No, you're writing for performance. You're going to engage somebody to stand in front of a microphone and deliver this, and they better deliver it in a way which engages the listener. Jonathan Swift said the definition of style is the correct words in the correct order.
Yes. And
correct words doesn't just mean that they are literally and in a literal sense the word that
correct.
says what you want it to say. It also means the word that makes the viewer, the listener, go, oh, haven't thought of it like that.
Yeah.
So if I go back to that opening line, I mean, it's not, it shouldn't be in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, but it's enough of a line to make I hope, to make the listener go, huh? What? How? Oh, that's interesting. And now I'm looking at Queen Victoria's funeral and someone's telling me a story. And that's, I think, what writing for performance as a sort of mindset helps the writer to do.
To achieve. So on that point, interestingly, for The Price of Empire, you also became the narrator.
Yes.
So when you were initially writing it, were you always aware you were going to become the narrator? Did that happen somewhat organically?
Okay, so the answer to that is, I'm afraid, an extremely prosaic and practical or pragmatic. So, I think anybody who writes for performance and doesn't read their stuff back out loud is making a big mistake.
Absolutely.
And I've always done that, and people who live with me never get used to it. Walk in and go, "What? Oh, so, were you on the phone?" No, I was just reading my. I thought you had someone with you. No, I'm just reading.
I was enjoying my own company.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so that's one point. I think you should always read your stuff back, and partly to make sure that it works, and partly to make sure that you're not asking the voice artist to have more breath than is humanly possible. But also, how does it sound? Anyway, so what we do here as a process. Once the script is written and goes into edit, someone, doesn't matter who, someone, but preferably someone who can do a half-decent job, does a guide read, which the editors can then work to.
And actually cut their story to
cut the story, get the timing and so forth. We don't get the professional talent in until the script is completely locked off for obvious reasons, and then the professional talent comes in. So what happened with Price of Empire was that I did the guide reads, and they, as they say, have gone to air. The reasons substantially is to do with budget, but it's to do with budget and choices that you make. So you want to go around the world, and in every city you're going to have to engage a stringer cameraman and a fixer and interview these people. And where's the money going to come from? So initially the budget was done and there wasn't enough money to do that.
To visit all of the eyewitnesses. Yeah.
So there's a trade-off to meet every single one of them and to be entrusted with their stories by those people was it's just absolutely memorable
and humbling,
experience.
No doubt. Yeah.
And so I have no doubt that the decision to go with that and have me doing the narration rather than getting in a professional voice talent who would have done a better job.
Well, it's debatable, Michael.
Well, let's say even if it was that would have been a better read, I don't think it would have compensated for the omission of the interviews that are there.
On that note, in this first episode, there is only just one eyewitness account, as you've already mentioned. Everyone's experiences happened later in the war.
Yep.
But there's one interviewee who was part of the Kwantung army, Hideyuki Kuribayashi.
Yeah.
I think I'm saying his name correctly. I apologise if I'm not. Can you tell me a little about him and what it was like to interview him?
Well, it's extraordinary because we made contact with an expat English fellow who is a freelance cameraman in Japan, been there, resident there, and speaks fluent Japanese. And I had tried through the embassy and other means to be put in touch with the Japanese ex-servicemen's organisation, only to be told, no, there is no such thing. There's no such thing. No way, right? So, bless him, the camera guy who I contracted to work with me found Kuribayashi, and there are 3 interviews with Japanese people. So he found all 3 of those.
Okay.
And one he knew through his barber.
Wow.
And one is actually the Hiroshima survivor is a Hiroshima. He's a university professor. He's a Hiroshima guide as well. So he found him through the formal channels. And this guy Kuribayashi, he has his own private museum outside of Tokyo. So he agreed to be interviewed.
Yeah.
So we got the bullet train. I'm afraid I should have written it down and I don't remember it. We got a bullet train from Tokyo to some provincial place, maybe an hour on the train.
An hour.
Then we picked up the hire car and drove out into a sort of rather rainy, hilly countryside. And there at the side of the road was this private museum that was Kuribayashi's museum. And we went in there and then we introduced and he came back and he put his cap on. If you see the interview, he's got his army cap on.
His army hat on.
Right, so we're setting up, well, can we interview you in here with the, yes, and he said, and he sat down to be interviewed, and then he said, oh, just, and I'm doing everything, of course, through the
through the
camera
translator
guy and the 2 Japanese people who were his offsiders who came with us.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, oh, just a minute. I need to get something. And he shot off, this old guy, and he came back with the Japanese flag.
Okay.
Which he put up on the wall behind him. If you look,
you
can see the Japanese. Well, that was him. He felt, no, you've got to have this.
You've got to actually, we've got to nationalise this.
So that's how we came to him, and we're very fortunate because I didn't know until he started telling his story that he'd actually been part of the Kwantung Army. So he'd actually been to Manchuria.
Wow.
And then the fellow that we interviewed, who he met through his barber, he'd been in Burma. Right. And then we had the Hiroshima. So we had a very good representation of the Japanese experience. And we were very lucky.
What was his museum like?
Oh, it's really, I mean, he was obviously, he's a great Japanese nationalist and all of that.
Yeah.
It's like you've seen others. I mean, in a lot of the interviews that I did in the USA were in a similar sort of museum in New Jersey.
Okay. Yeah.
It was a private museum that was put together by the local branch of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, one of the American ex-service organizations. But again, it's this private museum, and his in Japan was just full of bits and pieces and helmets and models of battleships and things like that.
It was all war related.
Oh, it was all absolutely.
Okay.
Oh yeah. And similarly, the one in New Jersey equally. It's all war related, and it's even a couple of sort of beaten up bits of hardware in the parking lot outside in Japan. There was like a gun from somewhere or other. I think he just spent the whole of his life since he got back putting these things together. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Was there anything that he told you in the interview that now, 7.5 years later, that really sticks with you? Other than, of course, the surprise that he was there in Manchuria.
Well, what doesn't go into the program is interesting.
Okay.
So he was then in Manchuria when Soviet troops came in 1945, and he was
Wow.
taken prisoner. And he was a prisoner of the Soviets for years. And the reason that he survived was that he had some sort of veterinary qualification. He was only a young man, but I don't know what it was. But anyway, so he looked after their horses, so he survived imprisonment until he was released. I mean, I think in the early 50s he finally got home.
Okay, so
Yeah.
he was imprisoned for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
Wow.
So his was a really interesting story, and he told of leaving, and then when he gets back, of course, he finds that his mother, not his father as well, they were dead, of course, because he's been gone for so long, and all of that. So
It's just incredible, some of these accounts from the eyewitnesses in this story. In this episode, you make a number of interesting points that come across as almost throwaway lines. You ask the question, was Emperor Hirohito in fact a decision maker to the level of Stalin or Hitler, or was he more interested in marine biology? I had no idea he was a marine biologist. What's your opinion?
Well, first of all, he was, and I mean that's the popular image is of him as this sort of marine biologist in his lab. I don't know, counting the scales on fish or whatever ichthyologists do. But so there was a book that came out in the 70s, I guess, called Japan's Imperial Conspiracy by an American named David Bergamini. And that really blew open the argument of how participant in decision-making had Hirohito been. And Bergamini... Bergamini, for example, he analyses the world tour that Hirohito went on as Crown Prince. Right. And according to him, as part of his world tour, Hirohito was making sketches of the water supply in Hong Kong.
Okay.
or was it Singapore? But anyway, it was fundamental to the way they, then
they went
launched their
tour.
Offensive in 41, 42. So there's one argument. And the other argument, of course, is that he sits behind a screen and just doesn't do anything.
Right.
And it's really difficult. I don't pretend to know, or in fact, I don't pretend that we'll ever probably conclusively know.
Yep.
My feeling is that he was more relevant to the decision making than the idea of him as some sort of ceremonial puppet.
Right.
Puppet.
Yeah. Not
puppet. And puppet. Puppet would allow, but not in any way in that sort of autocratic sense that one can see in the decision making of the Third Reich, for example.
Right.
It's clearly the decision making was very much a top-down autocracy, and that's not, I think, the case in Japan. But I think he was more influential than purely figurative, if you know what I mean.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's been incredibly illuminating and a little bit terrifying talking with you.
It's been a pleasure.
So tune in next week as we dive into the beginnings of World War II with Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939. This is Dan Jobson, and I've been talking with Michael Cove, the creator, writer, and narrator of The Price of Empire.
You've been listening to a Chronicle podcast.